Okay, well, good afternoon. And today in the speaker series, we have something a little bit different. We have Sharon Wright from the faculty at St. Thomas More College here at the University of Saskatchewan doing a legal history presentation. And she holds her PhD from the University of Toronto and has research interests in medieval England, conflict and violence studies, Crusades history, the Middle Ages in film, and other areas. She's held a Shirk Standard Research Grant on women, conflict and gender in the wake of the plague. And she's sometimes working over here in the law library because apparently we have some documents that bear on older legal history. And she's speaking today on Reported Conflict and Natural Disaster, a case study of the Wakefield Manor Leet courts through the 14th century plague epidemics. And so, with no further ado, thank you.
Okay, well, I'll try not to bore you all. I do have some statistics that I'm going to show you, and I saved those right for the end. So as you're ask questions as I go along, in some ways that's preferable to me if I'm saying things that you're unfamiliar with. I always worry about giving papers at law schools because I assume there'll be, like my old law professors out there wanting to quiz me on Maine legislation and things like that, which I don't know a great deal about. But today I'm going to talk to you about my research, which has been funded by Shirk, which is looking at patterns of fighting in the 14th century and how they changed around the period of the worst of the plague deaths. And in particular, in the question of how men and women were reported for certain kinds of offenses and how that reporting changed in the immediate wake of the plague. And then, as you'll see closer to the end of my talk, what I found very interestingly is that in every other case, over a long period of time, men and women's, the reporting of men and women's misbehavior is very similar, and there's about a 15 to 20 year period in which women sort of disappear from the courts. And so a lot of my research has been thinking about why, what are the sort of gender motivations behind that. So what you're looking at on the first slide there is just so you know, is the Chantry Chapel that's come from the bridge over the River Calder. That's at the center of the Wakefield Manor, which is where most of my research comes from. Can you see this with the light on it? Yeah, okay. So just to remind everyone, I'm dealing with English records, and specifically you'll see Yorkshire. Now it's North Yorkshire at the top there. In the Middle Ages, Yorkshire was much larger. It's been divided up now into 4 sections, but the whole West Riding and the sort of splotch in the middle is particularly the area in which I'm dealing with. So the records that I'm using are records that would be known as common law records. There's some differences to them than what we think of as regular standard common law in the modern period. This manor belonged to Edward the Confessor before the Conqueror crossed in 1066, and then it belonged to Harold Godwin, who's the last of the Anglo-Saxon kings. So it was a royal manor. It was about 6,000 hectares. That's somewhere around 15,000 acres of land, if you don't know the hectare system. And it was given by William the Conqueror to a very well-established baronial family called the Earls Warren. So they owned land in the south of England, and they owned this chunk of land, and they hired administrators to run it, thank God, because they actually kept the records efficiently. I'm going to show you what they look like in a few minutes and talk about how I collected my data a little bit. But there are 2 really important town centers here, Wakefield and Halifax. I marked Huddersfield because most people who work on medieval history will know it too. There's not a lot left that looks like it did in the Middle Ages because it's in a heavy coal mining area, so you don't expect to go back and see anything left from the Middle Ages. But I'm interested in, there's this very large run of medieval rolls. They enrolled their records on large pieces of parchment, and they have rolls that go from 1274 right up to 1926 when the Land Acts changed. It's one of the longest runs of records available, 670 rolls altogether, and my study is mainly from 1323 to 1410. The 1323 date is because before that the records are unstable enough. They don't start collecting, enrolling, or none of the rolls have survived after late 1270s, I think, is when they first started enrolling them. So they were just too spotty, and you'll see why eventually. So just to give you a sense of why this was an important center, even though it was very far up in Yorkshire, it was on the old Roman road that known as the Wakefield Gate that went from the south. So all the justices itinerant, justices in ire, jail delivery justices would have traveled up through this road. There are cases of many of them being waylaid by robbers and local peasants who weren't terribly happy with them arriving to do things like hear cases of jail delivery at the castle in York. If you're going to see breakouts or people sort of trying to bust their relatives out of jail, it was usually you'd get wind of the justice's itinerant coming, and then people would ride up to the jails and break them out at that time. So the jail delivery rolls are full of jail breaks as well as just administering justice to local ne'er-do-wells. It gives you a sense of what it looks like. So for the manor, most of rather than justice being administered in courts or court buildings or moot halls, which is the moot hall comes from the Middle Ages, it was held in the church. So this is what the church at Wakefield looks like today, All Saints. And there's the medieval church Iffley at Oxfordshire, which is probably a lot more what it looked like. So all the peasants would come, all the tenants of the manor, free and unfree. Some of them would be serfs, some of them would be free. Serf is a kind of for those of you who don't know, sort of quasi-free status. You usually had to buy your freedom. They would come every 3 weeks for the manor court or the court baron. And there are two kinds of courts. I'm mainly dealing with the criminal courts. The court baron dealt with civil pleas, debt, dower, trespass, fines for failure to perform services owed, that sort of stuff, and I don't use them, but the records were kept every 3 weeks. That's why there's 670 rolls, right, for that huge length of time. It's the court Leets, or the sometimes known as the turn, also the sheriff's turn, that I work with. So again, just to remind you where we are, the administration of that land, this is what it actually looks like. That's the sort of brownish blotch in the middle of the page. There's a section up the middle that belonged to another lord, so they had to cross through other lords' territories when they were administering it and hearing cases. And it was, it was also divided into townships. So the records are quite complex in the sense that there's also parish divisions that are part of this as well. But you see all the townships. Now, for the court Leets, the petty criminal courts, they were concerned with keeping the peace. They were concerned with anything that had to do with what we think of as petty criminal acts or misdemeanors. Things, when a murder happened, that would be sent up to larger courts. So these are lower level courts. And one of the reasons why I wanted to work with them is you're more likely to get accurate reporting. At medieval law, it was very easy to buy things like pardons for homicide and to, if you had money, to not end up in front of a justice at some point. So I was interested in what was happening at the level of the peasants. Right? So this area, instead of the whole of the manor, instead of every 3 weeks, which was court baron, twice a year on a turn or ire or itinerant, you'd have the steward of the manor go through, and they divided it up into 4 parts. So you have the Wakefield bailiwick, and the tenants in the Wakefield bailiwick elected 14 constables. Then you have the Kirkburton bailiwick, and I think Kirkburton, just have to flip my page here, had 6 constables that they elected, so the tenants were electing their own constables. Brighouse had 11 constables, and Halifax, and showing now the townships, had 12. So you have tenants on the manor electing their own policing officials. all of these courts were supported by two kinds of jury, jury of presentment and, what was the other kind? Trial jury. I'm out of my head, right? And the jury of presentment functioned in the way that the constables, local people would report criminal activities. Sometimes it would be through raising the hue and cry. Does everybody knows what the hue and cry here is? It's not a totally out of the blue. Okay, so hue and cry. If you see something in front of you that that's wrong according to the common tradition in the manor, you have to shout and attract the attention of everyone else on the manor to come down and to witness what has gone on, and then to report it. So I'm trying to think of an example. Oh no, the Dickens film where Nancy is killed by the horrible. It's the most recent one that's been released, and now I've gotten off my track and I can't remember which one it is. Oliver Twist, right. So they run into the street and they scream, murder, murder, murder. That's the hue and cry. They were still using it as sort of a folklore well into the 19th century. So if you heard the hue and cry and you ignored it, you could be fined. If you didn't raise the hue and cry when you'd done something like come across a body or come across an act which you knew was wrong, you could also be fined. So there's the manor operated in a kind of bonds of mutual awareness and connection in order to administer what people thought was the common good, right? It's a very different kind of a system now, right? We have an individual person calling up the police, 911, whatever. It was their 911, I guess is the best example. All right, so you'd go from the local community reporting the offense, either through hue and cry or just by going to the locally elected jurors, who were also tenants of the manor, or they would go, if there were constables, to the constable. And then once or twice a year, you'd have this Leet court come through your area, and the jurors or the constable would present the crime to the court, and then the judgment would be made. And usually by the time you got there, you knew you were going to be found guilty. It's very rarely in my records that I ever see anybody at that point not being fined for one thing or another. So the whole purpose of these courts, at one level, because they belonged to the Lord, the Warren family, who I talked about at the beginning of my chat, was to make money for them. These are courts that are given as a privilege, as a way for money to be made constantly. There were other ways of making money. If you were a lord, it would be things like you would own the mill, and everybody would be forced to grind their grain there, and then you would also own the only bakery, and everyone would be forced to, after they paid for the grinding of their bread or wheat, to cook it at the Lord's mill. So this is another form of sort of taxation, these courts. But they're more than that. They function with the tenants as a form of a place where you can air grievances. So in some cases, they weren't so concerned with the fines. They were more concerned with the fact that they would have their day in court. They would get to wage their law and say what they needed to say. So just so you have a sense of the kinds of what these records look like, they're very similar in the medieval period. They always will mark down what township you're dealing with. They're usually enrolled with the court barons, so the seniorial stuff, but they're marked off separately. And so I have just surveyed them. When you look at the data, you'll see, and it just comes from the turns or from the Leet courts. They're interchangeable words, sorry. So this one, just to show you, sometimes the skinniness of the data, which is why I use statistics, right? It'll tell you, here's the Alverthorpe, which is one of the townships, and then it reminds you in the bracketed section after it tells you how much is collected. So you know that they were in mercy, that's the fine, 2 shillings and 3 pence were collected. And here you know that John Philip is the constable, and his allies who were faithfully sworn. They report that Alicia from Southcliffe brewed illegally because brewing was illegal unless you had a license to do it. And then Magoda Stote, who's a woman that I work with a fair bit, drew blood, traxit sanguinum. She was fined 7 pence for drawing blood. And who did she draw it from? From from Alice, the wife of Henry Isbell, who happens to be one of her tenants, which I know from other kinds of work that I've done on it. And so that's the sort of stuff that I would read through and look for. I wanted to know what were the kinds of offenses that they were doing, engaging in, what was being reported, who was reporting them, and why. So I know later on that the same woman down here also fined a further 7 pence Magona Stout. She's a common communist rixatrix, that means a bitchy scold, not just a scold. And a litigatrix, a person who spends a lot of time at the courts bothering other people, right? That was considered a common nuisance. You could be fined for that, right? Okay, so those were beautiful. These are the ones that I've spent a lot of slow hours over, since you get those gorgeous ones that you can actually read as long as you have Latin, and know that the contractions. But these are repaired in the 19th century. They had water damage, so you spend a lot of time with blue light at the British Museum, really wishing that you'd worked on modern law instead of this stuff, right? That's why I, instead of working with original numbers in my data, I will smooth the data by looking at sort of 5 years, every 5 years I put it together, so you'll see what I mean when I go there. Okay, so the kinds of things that I'm interested in are, and what comes out very clearly is that they prosecute verbal offenses, verbal violence, or verbal abuse almost at the same price that they were prosecuting physical abuse. Now, if it was very violent physical abuse, there would be higher fines attached to them. But the verbal fines, things like defaming, so calling someone's good name into question because your reputation was so important in a you couldn't reestablish your reputation in a society based on papers that you might have if the vast majority of people in your community were non-literate. I mean, careful not to call them unliterate because most people could sign their names, and they also knew the importance and value of documents. So the kinds of things that on the verbal side would be defaming. It would be raising the hue and cry when you're involved in a conflict yourself. So I'd have to determine if there was a fighting going on and you were raising the hue and cry. And they made a distinction between raising it justly and raising it unjustly. Unjustly would be, oh, I want to get you in trouble, so now I'm going to stand in the street and I'm going to scream, murder or danger or fire or something, and then blame you. So there's a sense amongst the community that they knew that people could cry wolf when they were using this, and they find it. Intimidating, hard to know exactly what intimidating is. Mostly you'd find men that were listed as intimidators, quarrelers, scolders, and threateners. And on the physical side, you get abducting, beating, brawling, drawing blood, and killing. And killing would be shifted up fairly quickly to the higher crown court. So those are the sorts of things that I was looking at. Then I wanted to think about who was being reported. Now, when I first started doing this, I did not expect at all to get the results that I did in Wakefield. It's possible that the North is different, that there are a lot more bellicose women there. But previous historians, Barbara Hannawalt in particular, and using the higher courts, had found that only 1% of the people presented were women. So when I discovered that, I was looking at Verba, I'm sorry, I'm just going to go this one. So when I was looking at these records, I was blown away to find that 21% of all of the cases that I collected were women. So this means that this court was reporting women at a much higher rate, and men, so you can see down here, 2,628 cases of men engaging in all those forms of conflict that I just listed on the previous slide, and about 687 women. So suddenly and unexpectedly in my research, I had a very large pool of women doing what were they doing. First, I'm just going to go back to that slide that I stuck in there. I was interested in how much physical conflict versus how much verbal conflict. And really, the courts weren't that interested in getting reports or hearing about verbal conflict by comparison to physical. So it was physical conflict that they were really anxious to try and control. Well, what I found when I wanted to look at what were women doing, what were those 21% of women doing, Well, the biggest proportion of them, again a big surprise for me, 52% of them were engaged in physical conflict, or better to think about it as their physical conflict was being reported at the courts, because who knows how much was actually going on. And I've spent now a fair bit of time trying to figure out exactly, who they were fighting with and who these women were. But I'm working with about 100 years of records, and you saw the kind of handwriting I deal with, so it takes a fair bit of time. I have some ideas. Women who are listed as married at the courts are far more likely to use physical force than women who are unmarried. Women who are unmarried are far more likely to use verbal threats and intimidation than women who were married. So that was a big surprise as well. There's a large proportion of them that are engaged in conflict where they raise the hue justly, 27%, and unjustly about 13%, and then all this scolding category, which becomes very interesting as you move forward into the 15th century. Because scolding gets to be the most common report for women who are misbehaving. Even if they're hitting one another, they ignore that, or they might report it, but what they find them for is the fact that they're using their tongues to be violent to other people, especially against men. They're more likely to be reported. Whereas men, you see that there's hardly any reports for verbal fighting. There's actually, 5 cases in the whole time that I looked at, so it actually shows up as 0 here, but it's more like 0.08%, and the unjust hue was just slightly under 2% using the hue justly, and then the physical conflict totally dominating the male group. All right, so I wanted to look at this not just in aggregate, but over time. What does this look like over time? And again, not very many people have been able to do this over a 100-year period for medieval records, because the records are not, either they're crown records, and there's so many of them, upwards of 1 million, I think, from the last time I talked with people who are working on them. Very difficult to do the kind of long study without having a team working on it. Most historians work on their own. So what I have here, also totally unexpected, I couldn't explain initially the huge bulge of fighting that I saw at the beginning from about 1323. Now the plague happens in 1348, so that explains why suddenly, boom, we have half the kind of reporting, because about 1/3 to 1/2 of the manor's population died in the plague. So I had more questions about the fighting on the manor. Why the big peak, and why was it dropping before the plague? Well, from about 1316 to about 1323, there was the devastation of famine. If you're interested in looking at terrible sort of events, the kinds of things that have happened recently, famines, plagues, the 14th century is your century. That's what you want to study. So there was a huge famine, often known as the Great Famine, which took about 1/3 of the population of Europe, and the rest were left very weakened. And as things improved, suddenly the fighting on the manor is spiking. And at the same time as things are improving, the Scottish wars between the English and the Scots were finished, and a whole bunch of troops came home. So in addition to conditions being better, you also have the arrival of a large number of troops, and the lord of the manor sends down a new steward who, lo and behold, is also a justice of oyer and terminer, hearing and determining cases, so he knows law very well. He's been trained in London, and he spends 3 whole years prosecuting everybody he can get his hands on, right? And then we have the plague in 1348, and we can see kind of an erratic drop. So I wanted to separate that and have a quick look at what's the difference between men and women. Now, women only 21%, you remember, so I just want to, for those of you who don't love graphs, this side going up to 120, that's showing men, and it's the other side of the graph, only going up to 60, is showing women. So I've taken the women's line and I've made it more visible so that you can see without trying to do anything sneaky with the statistics. And what you can see is that there's very similar patterns of reporting, even though the women's numbers are significantly lower. but even in that big period of fighting. But here is what really caught my eye. You've got this drop, which is quite significant over a period of time, and then suddenly you have women being presented for the kinds of things that they were always doing, you know, fighting and drawing blood and whatever else they were doing. Some of them with things like billhooks and clubs, right? So we're not talking about women who were just like scratching and pulling hair. We're talking about gals who worked in the fields and they used the implements of destruction that they could carry along with them, right? Some of them. Anyway, all right. So much of the research that I've been doing from this point on has been trying to figure out what explains that in terms of the culture. What's the gender stuff that's going on in the background? Because is it that we had so many women die that they weren't actually fighting? Well, is it that that the population was so low in general? But no, we can see that men sort of recovered. There's another period here where you see the pattern comes down. You have another plague called the children's plague that comes and kills a whole bunch of children, and then you have a spike again. And I think my data is quite unstable after about 1380, so I include it so people can see it, but it really tails off. People were starting to use different court systems by the end. So I'm still left with that question of how to explain it. Much of my theory about it, it has to do with, looked a little more closely at what the women were doing. So this is just the women's line broken down into verbal and physical. And you can see the bottom line being a physical conflict. Fewer reports of physical conflict along the bottom, and kind of not terrible interest either sort of around the 1560s in women's verbal conflict. It seems to me that what's happening there is in a time of crisis, it's far more important to get control of the men in a community who will be the ones who come and take over the important manor offices. No one was particularly worried whether women were fighting either with one another or other men on the manor, because after you've lost half of your older sort of community leaders, the ones who are going to have to take over will be the younger men who've been involved in all kinds of fighting earlier on. I'm going to need to explain that a little bit. And nobody was particularly worried about the kind of fighting that women were doing. And the reason I say this is on the manor, I can see by looking at smaller case studies that you have young men who would get up to no good. They were charged with things like night walking. Night walking was a man's offense, by the way, in the Middle Ages, because it meant that you were eavesdropping and listening at people's doors. They were fighting, they were brawling in the taverns, and eventually the jurors would get sick of this and would say, right, you need to be the constable. So what I found out is that all of my fighting men, at one point or another, if they were repeatedly showing up in the records, in that big bulge, and then it's with some of the families afterwards, that they would be most likely to become jurors and constables and enforcers, right? And with women who couldn't hold any kind of public office, people didn't know what to do with them. They ignored them, which seemed to happen when it was really important to stabilize things after the plague. And then when things got a little bit settled, they started to come up again in terms of the amount of reporting that was going on. But again, looking at case studies, women behaving exactly the same way as men, drawing blood, beating one another with bill clubs, men or women, their victims being men or women. They didn't know what to do with them, so they started calling them scolds. And the further you go towards the end of my line, the more likely it is in the record that you'll have women being called scolds and being told to behave, and you'll have their brothers or the men with whom they're fighting being brought up into the administration of the manor. So that's what I'm thinking right now. And I guess I'd really love your questions, any questions that you have. I don't want to belabor you with more graphs and slides, but it's always helpful to me to hear what other people are thinking about that sort of stuff, or if there's just things that you'd like me to explain that I covered too quickly.
more practically, I'm just fascinated by what the research process must be like. So, what does this involve by way of you actually have to go where the scrolls are? Obviously, I guess there aren't electronic versions of them. And then what? You're writing them out in Latin and then figuring out how does all that work?
Yeah. Okay. So they've been microfilmed.
Oh yeah.
Okay. All 670 of them. And my research assistant, who hates me, over the last 2 years has digitized them.
Wow.
So I can make them available to any of you who want to do this kind of research now. But I'm the first person, I think, who's digitized a large chunk of them. There's a big section that have been translated, transcribed and translated in the Yorkshire Archaeological Record Series. So you can go and look at them. I assure you they're about the best antidote to sleeplessness that you'll ever have when you actually read through them all. So yeah, the process is you sit there and you read through them all, and then you're just collecting the data case by case. So I've been through every single one of these cases probably 3 times just to make sure I haven't missed something. And in the sections where the material is very damaged, you can use, well, some of it's been fixed now, but you can use blue light, which is not good for your eyes, you know, if you're really desperate. But that's why I smooth the data. That's why I, you know, work in 5-year averages rather than, you know, working with the raw data, because, you know, you'll lose things. And when you've got a big chunk out of your stuff, you know, it's disappeared. So.
And is that a conventional alphabet being used there?
Yeah. I'll go back to the better one. You probably can recognize some of it, but it may to you, this may look like impossible to read, but if you've been trained in paleography, this is a godsend, because when you get into the 16th century where people who aren't trained are writing their own stuff, it's like reading my children's handwriting, you know, who they hate writing. So they'll make their own notes. This is all very rational. Every time you see a line on top of the writing, here's let's see if I can find an example here. Okay, that's item, and I know that some of the letters have been left out because there's a line on top. So it gets to be reading a bit like a crossword puzzle, but once you're comfortable with it, you can cruise through it about as fast as English. It's if you're dealing with untrained hands that it's that's why I'm a medievalist as opposed to a 16th century specialist. I can't read that hand. Yeah.
My substantive question, thanks for that, it's
okay.
Fascinating. But so I'm interested in, on one level you're interested in this as evidence of activity that's going on. So actual physical conflict or whatever, or verbal. And then on the other hand, you've got the problem of the reporting issue. So do you sort of cut it in the middle and suggest, or you know, sometimes indicate whether or not it's over-reporting, I don't know, but how do you tease those out?
That's always the problem when you're working with crime reporting, right, is what are those dark figures? Meaning, you know, what is actually happening versus what's actually being reported, right? And so if I wasn't clear enough, my whole approach to this is I'm dealing with reporting. I'm interested in how reporting changes, because reporting is indicative of attitudes, especially in manorial culture, and there's no other way to find out. I mean, maybe you could use your high point for thinking like this is the most possible cases you could get, because we had a very well-trained judge come in who was very carefully trying to catch every ne'er-do-well, and that might be my highest indication of what levels of crime actually were. And then the lowest points being periods where they just couldn't get themselves together to care about anybody but the worst offenders. Right? So I think about it more in terms of what people thought was important to complain about. Right. Yeah. Okay.
I was fascinated by the methodology you have to engage in to get the results that you have. I mean, obviously, it has a lot of work. You have a lot of admiration, I think, among this group for that. I was wondering, the time period that you're looking at, do you see the transition or the beginnings of a transition from a more passive, from a more active trial jury, in terms of actually going out and investigating and presenting their findings to the to the court, to the more passive jury that we see today, or is it still fairly static in the time period you're looking at?
I think, well, you have to remember that jurors were usually the better off tenants on these manors, and you've got a different system of juries in the Crown courts than what you have in these manor courts, but they use juries of presentment as well as trial juries in the higher courts. So the juries of presentment were made up of jurors, sometimes 12, sometimes as few as 6, and it was their job to go down and to talk to everybody who was involved in a case. So if you found a body, it would be the jurors that were there first, and then they might call the Crown, when they call them crowner, they might call the coroner at that point, right? And so then the coroner would interview the jurors as well. So they would often be brought up as witnesses. So there's this weird traffic between someone who might have been a constable at one time, who's now a juror that had been called up for a special case, someone who had special knowledge. And then, as you see later on, when juries were taken out of the community, less interest and involvement, and there just to hear the story and make a decision. And that transition would be after my period, probably happening more in the 17th century, so a good almost 300 years from where I'm at.
So at this point, they're still very, very active.
Very, oh yeah, wanting to know, and often they might be literate, right? Possibly. Your judges would be, your steward of the manor who presided over the court would be, but it was the jury that made the decision. So they would do the research first, hear everything, come and present it, and already in their minds they knew what the result would be. Right.
Now, I find it odd that the men who were convicted of physical violence would then be promoted to administrative positions,
Yeah.
positions. And it raises questions, what was the underlying theory of crime? What was their underlying theory of public office? I mean,
Right.
we wouldn't do that today.
No.
Right?
Well, we hope we wouldn't do it today.
So what does it tell us about the way they viewed the causes and the solutions to crime?
Well, you're still dealing with what they think of as later feudal culture. So might is right in many cases, and keeping the peace, however they would define that peace, which usually means keeping order, making sure that your social elites are in command of your non-elite strata. So what you want is someone who's not afraid to use force when necessary in order to keep the peace. So you want a more mature headbuster to be sent down into the taverns to get control of the younger folks that are in there sort of rumbling it up, right? And so the force is very much a part of medieval society. I mean, if you were a man in that period, your chances are 1 in 4 of dying in some kind of violent activity, whether it's warfare, whether it's just fighting, right? So people talk about crime going up now. We have a much, much safer community, an increasingly safer community compared to what medieval was like. So in terms of the theory, I mean, there's a long history of the crown and the elite, the barons, trying to gain control of the medieval world through the use of the courts, as well as through the use of force. So it's a way of being powerful. The king wanted control of those courts because he got money from them, but it also meant that he was undercutting his barons, who were often his worst enemies, right? So it was a system of power and power structures. So what you want is the person who can enforce it, whatever it is that they're enforcing. The English were very litigious. They liked their courts, and they used them. So there's a real balance between the discourse of peace and the use of force to maintain that peace. It doesn't really end until after the Civil Wars.
But it seems like there's not very much weight put on judgment, right? When force is necessary.
No,
it wouldn't be.
I see what you're saying, but in the community, really, it was the community that controlled the judgment. So if you look at the kinds of crimes, not some of the ones that I showed you, but the things like being a common ne'er-do-well, what does that